Hey guys, welcome to the comprehensive guide on how to beat the Benoni system. If you're someone who plays d4 and hates this dreaded c5 move at any given point in the game, which leads to the Benoni system, this video is for you. I'm going to show you guys all of the Old Benoni, Modern Benoni, and some of the sideline ways of how to beat the Benoni system in the most efficient, practical, and engine-tested way. So let's begin. So one thing to keep in mind is I'm not going to be talking about the Benko Gambit, which is this. This is a completely different beast in its own right that we will cover in the next video. However, right now we will only be talking about the Benoni system, the modern Old Benoni, and the sidelines. Let's begin with the Old Benoni. This is the most straightforward option. After you play d5, you're going to get hit with e5. So you're going to play e4. You're not going to take en passant. You have to resist the temptation and just play e4. After d6, and by the way, your opponent has a million moves here. They could go for a g6, bishop g7 setup. This is something that we'll cover in the modern Benoni, so instead of covering the same thing twice, I'm going to cover this d6, bishop e7 setup, and how to beat that. Your opponent can also start with knight f6, and in which case our move order is slightly different, but the whole point is it's going to lead to the same position, so it's not something you really have to worry about. Also, yes, I am now wearing glasses. I've recently discovered that glasses help improve your vision, which is a revolutionary concept to me, and so I've decided to start wearing them now. If after d6, we're going to play knight e2. So knight e2 is not something that's commonly played, and the whole point of this is we're going to take black out of their preparation. This is a great move. It's engine tested, like it's engine proof. Engine loves this move, and the whole point is we're going to play knight c3 with the e2 knight, which looks very odd, but actually our b knight is going to d2 and then c4. So we're going to have these two knights right here, which is their optimal squares. The knight on c4 has the ability to jump into a5 at any moment, and then to c6. It also pressures this d6 square, so it's very good. And then the knight on c3 is just the knight on c3. It protects these two pawns like it should. Obviously, if we started with this regular knight going to c3, this knight can never make it to c4, so this is a much greater alternative. Of course, if your opponent starts off with knight f6, we don't want to play knight e2 and blunder a pawn. We instead want to play knight d2 and then just kind of reroute, essentially, and because after d6, which is one of the only other moves, you're going to play knight e2 anyway, and it leads to the exact same position. So let's continue. d6, knight e2, bishop e7, knight c3. So this is the bishop e7 setup. Usually your opponent is going to go for g6 and bishop g7. However, bishop e7 is the second most popular move, and it's the kind of main line of the Old Benoni. Knight c3, knight f6, and we're going to play a4. We always want to play a4 in these sort of setups, and the reason for that is, well, usually you're going to see a6 first, and then you're going to play a4 because it prevents b5. But there's no point in delaying that right now. We can play a4 right away because we're going to play knight a3 and then knight c4. We want to keep this bishop open just in case. And so by playing a4, we're taking up more space. We're allowing this knight to jump into a3 without blocking this a pawn. And we're just, taking space. We're preparing against an a6 move. Castles, knight a3, knight e8. Why does black play knight e8 in this situation? Well, very simply put, black wants to achieve a pawn break. In Benoni systems, pawn breaks are kind of essential. Like, there's nothing else that, if black doesn't achieve a pawn break, black is going to be worse. Just there's less space, less development, and they're got a worse pawn structure. So pawn breaks like f5 are very much necessary for black. That's why knight e8 is a strong move, because it allows f5. Obviously, your opponent might not go for knight e8. They might go for knight d7, in which case the same exact concept would apply. What I'm trying to teach you guys are the main ideas and some of the tactics that you're going to be using in these games, and then you're going to be able to employ them. So you don't have to learn these moves exactly. It's not going to be possible to memorize so much theory, especially for a variation you might see, 5-10% of the time when you play d4. You don't see the Benoni system in every game you play, and so you're not going to be able to memorize sharply 30, 40, 50, 100 moves of theory. So it's better to just remember the ideas. And the point is, knight e8 is the most popular move, and in response to that, we're going to play very beautiful move, g4. So g4 is a very strong move. The point is, it completely prevents f5. If you get f5, you take this pawn. Now you've opened up your g file, rook g1, and you're going to checkmate your opponent in the next 10 moves. The reason you're able to afford doing this, and this looks like such a strange move, right? That's what engines have given us. They've given us this gift of modern chess theory, and the ability to use, our g and h pawns, our a and b pawns, very early on in the game to create, very strong attacks. So g4 stops this completely, and the reason we can afford to do this is because we don't actually need to castle. We can keep our king on e1. The king is quite safe here, surrounded by a bunch of pieces. And if all goes wrong, we can actually just castle queenside. So, g4. Knight d7. Okay, that makes sense. Knight wants to go to b6, as he normally does. We're going to play knight c4, achieving our goal of placing this knight on c4. a6, this prepares b5. Very simply put, this is not possible right now. If b5 was played, let's say like white skips a turn and just plays f3, b5 is not possible because you win a rook. So we don't really need to worry about that right now. We can just play queen f3. Queen f3 on its own doesn't make much sense. Like the queen on f3 doesn't actually attack or support anything new. It just kind of exists there. The whole point is that the queen on f3 kind of is vacated from her original square, and now she's going to be able to go to g3 or h3 if the pawn is on h4 and start this kingside push, kingside attack that we're going to use to win this game. So rook b8 prepares b5. We don't want to worry about that right now. If b5 happens, we are going to win the game. We're going to win material. We're going to play knight d1. Why are we playing knight d1? Well, we've realized now that, hey, we have this g4 pawn push. We're actually going to be attacking this king. So instead, we're going to play knight e1, or sorry, knight e3, knight f5, and then that's going to help us push h4. Currently, we cannot play h4 because there are two pieces that guard the square. So we need another piece that supports this h4 square in order to push this pawn successfully. b5 is something that your opponent might try, and if they do that, they're going to lose. You're going to take this pawn, and then you're going to play knight a5. Now you notice there's a knight c6 fork attacking this queen and the rook. This is what you're going to use to win your game. Now, no matter what your opponent does here, you win material. If rook a8, knight c6, you might notice that, hey, my opponent has blundered. If they move like queen b6 or something, you just win a rook. And if like their best move here is to just take your rook and then sacrifice this queen, so they get a piece and a rook for a queen, I would say you're definitely winning that trade. You're in a much, much better position, and h4 is now once again possible. So that might happen. Your opponent can try, knight b6, in which case you play bishop takes b5. This is a sacrifice temporarily, because after the rook takes, you're going to play knight c6, kicking the queen out to, let's say, b6 once again, and then you can just take on e7, and you're once again, yet again, better. Another thing your opponent can do is bishop b7. Once again, bishop takes b5 is your best friend here, and you're just in a significantly better position. So the best move for your opponent by far is bishop h4. This is the only move that makes it very difficult for us to play this effectively. And after bishop h4, we're going to play a5. This further prevents b5 because then you can just play en passant. Now this does allow the opposing knight to go into c7 and b5. Whoops, not a5, but b5. But we're not really worried about that because from b5, this knight doesn't really attack much. We've kind of removed most of our pieces from this queen side, and now we're aiming at the king side, so we don't really care. Your opponent's best bet is to try b6 here and try and open up this position. You can trade all these pieces all you want, and then you're just going to jump into a5, and once again, you're looking at the exact same idea with knight c6. Bishop d7 prevents that, and now, finally, knight e3, and you're going for knight f5. This knight has went back to f6 because going to b5 is no longer worth it, and so f6 is the better square. The knight on f5 now attacks his bishop. This bishop has nothing that it can do. It's currently trapped. So, bishop takes, g takes, and guess what? This bishop is, yet again, trapped. Queen e8, rook g1, king h8, knight c6. You don't even have to do all of this. You can just play queen h3 right away. But this is like the most optimal, the most cruel way you can play this. Just take what you can and then play queen h3, and now you just won the game. Awesome, right? So if they play this sort of a6 line and go for bishop h4, this is what you're going to be aiming for. You're going to try and place this knight on f5. You're going to try and trade it off. If the knight doesn't get traded off, you're going to take this bishop, and then you're trying to get the queen out of the way. Play h4, h5, g5, g6. All of these ideas are very strong. Rook g1, queen g3. You're going to checkmate your opponent in no time. Maybe even queen h3 and just keep this rook on h1. Going to be very good for you. So, like I said, this is not a very difficult position to play against. You're going to be very comfortable. Even if you don't checkmate your opponent, you're still going to be better just because your position is much stronger. Now, an alternative for your opponent, instead of a6 here, is this very good move, b6. Point is that bishop a6 becomes a possibility, and this very weak bishop goes on this very, very nice diagonal. How are we going to fight against that? Well, we're going to play queen f3 again. No point in learning 50, 60, 70, 100 moves of theory when you're never going to be able to memorize them. If you face this variation every single time you play d4, yeah, it would be worth memorizing, thousands of different moves because that's the only thing you face. But the Benoni system, you're probably going to face it less than 10% of the time at whatever rating you are at. So there's really no need to remember, a specific move for every response. Queen of 3 is a great move. It achieves the exact same thing. And as long as you learn the ideas, these moves are going to become second nature to you. So there's no point in, like I said, just jotting down moves of theory. Just remember queen f3. The point is that you're going to be able to play queen g3 or queen h3 at some point, and you'll be good. Now, bishop a6 is something your opponent might go for, and this immediately loses because you play h4. That looks like it blunders a pawn, and it sure does, because after this bishop takes, you're going to play g5 and blunder another pawn. However, now you've opened up this rook and the queen. The queen goes to h3. Checkmate is very close to being unstoppable. h6, bishop takes, queen takes, and then you take this knight on d7. Suddenly, you are up. You've got 2 pieces for 1 piece and 2 pawns, so you're better, and this is a great position. If you don't want to go for that, that is fine, but this is the most preferable position. Like h4 is definitely the best thing you can do right now. You could also go for something like rook g1 and then play g5 first, and then follow it up with h4. That way you don't have to sacrifice anything, but that is slightly slower and a little bit suboptimal. So bishop a6 loses. Once again, the most critical move is bishop h4. This is what we have to keep in mind. Knight e3. So we don't even have to go the knight d1 route, knight e3 and knight f5. We can actually just move the c4 knight to e3. The reason that we're going for a different knight this time is because previously the knight that was on c4 had the ability to jump into a5 and be very aggressive with knight c6 ideas. Here with the move b6, it's no longer able to go to a5. So we're going to put this knight on e3 and then jump into f5. Now, the best move for black is f6. There's a million things your opponent can do here. And at this point, the only thing I'm trying to show you are ideas. So all you have to learn are ideas. Oh, hey, I can attack my opponent by playing queen h3. I didn't really think about this move, right? There's no point in memorizing moves here because it's very unlikely you're going to face anything like exactly like this. f6 is the best move, but your opponent can also play knight c7. Your opponent can also play knight f6, h6, g6, just a bunch of different things. Queen f6 even, if they wanted to. But I'm just going to speed run kind of through these moves. If they play f6, you're going to play queen h3, kick this bishop to g5, and slide your queen to g2. The reason you're putting your queen on g2 is because you want to play h4. Now, after f6 has been played, this queen no longer sees this h4 square, so the pawn on h4 can be easily, freely pushed. Rook b8, h4, and yeah, you're doing great. If bishop h4 back, then knight f5 now. So if we play queen g2 and then the bishop goes back here, we can play knight f5, bishop back, and then h4 once again. And after these trades, you're going to be doing very well. So a6, just a random move. There really isn't much that your opponent can do that's going to be better than this. And you're going to play g5. Why is g5 strong? Well, because it opens up lines of attack. Once we get this pawn out of the way, this rook is going to be starting into h7. We can pile up our pieces and go for checkmate. This is why it's so strong. After this trade, let's say your opponent plays g6. Here, the critical move is queen h2. Yep, you can sacrifice this knight because it means checkmate. And you can also sacrifice this pawn because it also means checkmate. So technically, you're not losing anything. Your opponent has to play h5 right now to stop checkmate. If they play, let's say, I don't know, rook f7, for example, you have knight h6, and then you just win a rook, and, well, I mean, maybe a queen, but you don't need my guidance after you win a rook for free. So h5 is kind of the main move. Now, you don't want to take off a sign. You don't want to do any of that. You want to play a very cool move, rook d1. Rook d1 looks very strange, but let me try and explain it to you. So if we take a look here at what might happen, this knight is basically, let's say we just play a random move like, I don't know, b3. This knight is not capturable because once again we have this idea with checkmate, and this is almost unstoppable. Like knight g7, you're gonna play queen g6, and yeah, good luck, right? But what your opponent can do is take this pawn. And once your opponent takes this g5 pawn, your rook on c1 is under attack. So you have to go rook d1 now, or rook a1. Rook a1 is also a fine move. But then this knight on d7 goes to f6, and suddenly your attack is gone. What are you attacking anymore? You have no pieces that can infiltrate. Your knight is hanging. You're in a subpar position. So by playing rook d1 right now, if this pawn gets captured, guess what? We're no longer worried about our rook being attacked, and we can just play rook g1. So if we played rook g1 in the previous position without playing rook d1, our rook would get captured and we will lose. That's just the simple explanation as to why we're playing this rook d1 move. You could also play rook a1 if you wanted to, instead of rook d1. Both moves are completely fine. This is just up to your personal preference. Queen f6. Now you take this h5 pawn. Notice that neither of your pieces could be captured because there's a king in front of those pawns, so it's pinned. King moves out of the way. Queen h7. Knight g7. Somebody entered my house. I'll be right back. False alarm, guys. It was my parents. All right, let's get back to it. What are we on? Rook d3. So we're bringing the rook over. Rook lift. Rook g3. Attack this pawn. We're gonna sacrifice the knight. We're okay with that. I mean, we're not really sacrificing it because we're just gonna win it right back with the move rook d to g3. And the line kind of ends here. You're not going to face this exact move order. Obviously, you might win earlier, you might win later. But the point is, you're going to take this rook. Or sorry, you're going to take this knight with check. The game is pretty much over. You don't really need my guidance from here. The point of this line going so deep is that I'm just showing you ideas. And you're going to face similar positions, similar setups, just so you know what you're going to be doing once you get to those positions. Okay, so that really covers most of the Old Benoni. I guess other things that could happen after rook d1 is just king f7, which is technically the best move. So instead of taking the pawn and running into all sorts of trouble, black decides to be very, very solid. It's unlikely that your opponent's going to not take this pawn, but it could happen. In which case, you're still going to play rook g1. Now you're definitely not giving this pawn up. Rook h8. Keep in mind, if this knight gets taken, you take this pawn with the queen. Then you take this pawn with your e-pawn. And you're going to start working towards the same exact goal. You're going to push this pawn now. Knight e4 jumps in. This game is over. I mean, come on. You're going to promote to a queen. You get a new queen. Very, very easy stuff. You could even do queen takes f4 and then get a new queen. And yeah, this is just a great position to be in. But if your opponent doesn't take your knight and plays rook to h8 here, you can very simply play knight h6. After knight h6, let's say your opponent plays, I don't know, king g7 maybe. You're going to play bishop e2. And after bishop e2, your opponent is kind of stuck. Your opponent has no good moves. These knights cannot go anywhere because they get lost. So very simply, you're in a great position. Let's say bishop b7. Bishop takes h5. You sacrifice the bishop. Now you take with the queen. And guess what? Queen f7 is almost unstoppable. So queen e7. You can do rook d1 and rook f3. Sorry, rook d3 and rook f3, but you also have knight f5, check. And this, this, just wins the queen. If your opponent decides to go here, then guess what? You win the queen with check. This is unstoppable mate. Great position, guys. Once again, don't have to memorize these moves. Just remember the ideas. You have sacrifice potential because your attack is so strong. You don't care about losing a little bit of material. You're okay with sacrificing some pieces as long as you get the attack farther. As long as you continue down the attack. No, as long as you continue the attack. So guys, that really covers the Old Benoni. Just remember this 92, 93 idea. You're playing a3, you're doing all these things, and then g4, very, very strong move. As soon as this knight leaves the f6 field, just g4, and your opponent has a lot of trouble stopping that. So you're going to be very well off. Now, I want to show you guys a sideline that I faced recently in over the board game that really, really annoyed me. And I had a lot of trouble with it, but after some analysis, it's actually quite easy to face, and it leads to some very chaotic positions where white always ends up better. This is what I found. So the move is f5, and obviously d4, c5, d5, then f5. This is a not very rare, but it is quite rare. It's a sideline, and the point is, hey, it looks like you cannot play e4 now because you blundered the pawn. Now, what I found through some analysis is that actually is untrue. You can just play e4 anyway, and once they take the pawn, you play knight c3. So after knight c3, knight f6, you're going to play knight e2. You're going to put this knight on g3, and you're going to be very, very happy. Your opponent's going to play g6. Now, keep in mind, if they were to play e6, you have the ability to play knight g3 right away, or you can even start with bishop g5, and you're going to be very well off in that position as well. Most players, when they play this sort of line, they play g6. In fact, almost all of them do. So this is what we're going to be looking at. Knight g3, bishop g7. If e6 here, once again, bishop g5 is possible. Bishop g7, h4. Why are we launching this h4 attack? Well, because black's only way of castling is kingside. They're not going to be able to castle queenside anytime soon. So we're going to push our pawns as early as possible and create as much attacking potential as we can. h5 is coming next. Queen a5 prevents us from recapturing this pawn. We can play h5, doesn't really matter. If your opponent plays d6 here, which is the main move, then you're just going to play h6, kick this bishop out, and then bishop d2. If your opponent decides to take this pawn instead of d6, very simply, you're going to play bishop d2 again. Now, this pawn is ready to be taken at any moment via either this knight or this rook, depending on what you want to do. And yeah, your opponent just crumbles here. This is obviously a terrible position. Now, most players are not going to allow that to happen. They're going to just play d6. And so after the bishop retreats to f8, now we can notice how passive this bishop is. Technically, you're down 1 point of material. However, this bishop is entirely neutralized and cannot actually do anything. Bishop d2, you might get bishop g4. Your opponent can just go queen b6 here as well, which is fine. But most people are probably going to start with bishop g4. f3, trade, bishop back to d7. Look at all of your pieces being so in harmony. Very, very good position. Move your knight to e4. Queen is forced to draw back. If this knight trade happens, you just win a queen. Like, you know, at this point, the analysis ends. But queen sides back to b6, bishop c3, protects the b2 pawn. Also prevents this knight from capturing because, and I don't want you to get greedy here, don't take this rook because then you lose the g3 knight. But after you take here and rook g8, this is an almost ideal position. You can play queen e2 and afterwards go for knight f6. Now that this king is pinned, you're going to be able to win this rook and king. And the best move according to the engine is king d8 here, which just shows how desperate black's position really is. In which case you can play knight g5, follow it up with knight f7, or you can even just take h7 and then go back and promote to a queen. So yeah, very, very easy play from here. Now, if this doesn't happen and your opponent plays normally, like knight a6, which isn't really normal, but this is the main move in this sort of position, you can take the knight yourself, take this pawn, force this rook to move out of the way. Now you play queen e2. This king has to side to f7, and at this point you can just long castle. This is such a cool move because you're literally just offering up a bishop for free. If they take, then you go knight e4, check. Well, you can go knight g5, king slides down to f6, you take this pawn, king slides back, or knight g5, king f6, once again, queen d2 now. You're going to play h7 very soon, so let's say knight b4. You actually don't care about this at all. You can, well, you could play a3 or whatever like that, but h7 works perfectly fine. Yeah, let's say knight takes a2, king b1, knight b4. You queen, but at this point, after king b1, rook h8, and yeah, king takes a2, and then you're gonna have queen c3 check, and you're just gonna win this rook and promote to a new queen. So great position, nothing to be worried about here. Definitely completely winning. Now, any other line where your opponent doesn't take this bishop with their king, let's say they play rook e8, you can counter that with knight e4. You can notice that no pawns can attack this knight, meaning that it cannot get pressured into moving out of the way because, you know, it's been to the queen. So this knight is here to stay. It cannot really be attacked. And let's say knight b4 again, you can just play bishop h3. You know, queen a6 is the engine's best move, meaning that the engine actually prefers just losing a piece because it thinks that getting rid of the queen kind of mitigates the attack. So that shows how desperate the position really is. But besides that, let's say your opponent takes this pawn on e2. You can play king b2 and yeah, knight b4, bishop. Or if, let's say, I don't know, your opponent takes this bishop, then you go rook takes h3, and you go knight g5. So once again, sacrificing the bishop but winning the rook, and then rook g1, and this is checkmate. Obviously, you don't have to memorize all these moves. I'm just showing you guys how easy it is to kind of beat this variation. If you come prepared, you're going to have a great game going and facing against this variation just because it's not the best, and you get a great advantage right off the bat. So that covers this f5 line. But yeah, if you guys face this, make sure you're ready and you play e4. I didn't know this. I played c4, which isn't a bad move, but I played knight c3 and I felt very, very passive. I never actually played e4. I didn't really know what to do. And I just ended up in a subpar position, and eventually I kind of lost track of the game and lost control. Now, guys, I think it's time to look at the main move, which is knight f6. So the Benoni setup actually starts without the Benoni. You play c4, and then you get hit with c5, which is the Benoni setup. Here, the main move is the Benko Gambit. Like I said earlier, I'm not going to be talking about this in this video. This is not, this is a completely different opening, and it deserves a video of its own. So it's not worth covering it here. So we're going to take a look at e6, which is the Benoni defense. We're going to play knight c3, and we're going to get into this kind of setup with d6. We're going to play knight f3 here. Once again, white has a million setups. White has e4, e3, h3, f3, e4, whoops, f3, e4, e4, f4. You know, there's so many things you can do here. I'm showing you guys what I thought was the best, the easiest to learn, and the most comfortable to play. Knight f3, g6. So, in all modern Benoni setups, Black's going to fianchetto this bishop and try to, put pressure on this knight and to eventually win either the e4 or the d5 pawn, wherever it's possible. We're going to play h3. This is one of the best setups, one of the most well-reputable against the Benoni, just because it doesn't allow this bishop to come out. It eliminates a lot of counterplay. Your opponent here is going to play bishop g7. You're going to play e4, and they're going to castle. For a long time here, the main move was, sorry, not this, the main move, for a long time here, the main move was bishop to d3. Now, this is technically fine, but it runs into b5, which equalizes the position almost completely for black. You take this pawn with a knight, and then your opponent plays rook e8, you can castle, and then it goes into this position where actually you lose the e4 pawn for the b5 pawn. So this isn't great. The engine, as you can see, doesn't like it. It gives, well, it's a slight advantage for white, but yeah, the longer it thinks about it, it notices how equal this position is. And yeah, this is not what we're going for when we're playing against the Benoni. So what I've come up with, and technically the engine, what it has come up with, is this move knight d2. So knight d2 doesn't develop this bishop yet, meaning that if we see b5, we don't have to waste a tempo, and we can just take this pawn right away. Now there's no way for black to actually attack, because look at this. We're just going to take this knight. Let's say rook e8. We can even, well, first of all, we can take this rook, but if there was no bishop here, and it was on e2, as you can notice, there's no pin. This knight is well protected. If we get an f5, we just go to d2, for example, and this is a great position. So I really like the move knight d2 because it eliminates any possibility of b5. It really takes away from the Benoni setup. Now, what your opponent can do is play just rook e8 normally. You're going to play bishop e2. They're going to play knight e6. Now here, you might be wondering, what are we going to do? We're going to castle. But why not take this knight? Because this technically ruins black's pawn structure. And while you can do that, you just played bishop e2, so you're wasting a tempo. And it's a double-edged sword because, yes, you're ruining black's pawn structure, but you're also opening up their b file. So rook b8 is possible. It's going to be a little bit annoying to deal with. I say avoid that and just castle normally. There's really no need to do that because this knight isn't scary regardless. You're going to castle and this knight goes to c7, and it's going to try and apply pressure on this d5 pawn wherever possible, as well as this b5 square. So black is still going for this b5 idea. They're going to play a6 and b5 at some point. And of course, if black went for something like knight b4, just not sure what they would be doing here, you could play a3 and kick this knight out, and yeah, the position is completely fine. Let's see. But yeah, after knight c7, we're going to play a4. We're noticing this idea. So if the knight is on c7, that means black wants to play a5. Black wants to play b5 in almost every situation in the Benoni. So a4 should be like a very natural move for us. a6, rook e1, rook b8, and we can play a5. So this prevents b5 altogether. If we get b5 here, we can take this pawn. And after rook takes b6, there's very little that your opponent can actually do here because there's no counterplay to generate. So you would just play knight c4 here, and you'd be very, very good. Now, after a5, your opponent's likely going to play bishop d7. We're going to play bishop d3, and we're going to get something like knight b5. We're going to play knight f3. So if you notice something, we're kind of just rerouting and shuffling our pieces around. Right now, knight f3 is an important move because we need to get this bishop over to g5 if possible. We need to be able to move this bishop freely. This knight can get captured. Now, the main move here, by the way, is h6. That's the best engine move to prevent bishop g5. Whether or not that's going to happen, I say it's pretty unlikely. If you do face h6, what you do need to know is bishop f4. This attacks this d6 pawn. You're going to get hit with g5. And then bishop h2 looks very good for you. So bishop h2 is completely fine. If you get like, I don't even know what you might get here. But this is a great position to be in. Now, in my opinion, what you're more likely to face is knight takes c3. Since your knight is on c3 and black just plays their knight on b5, this is the most natural looking move. And so you're going to recapture with your b pawn. And you're likely going to get c4 here. What's important is that you don't take this pawn, because once again, this loses the e4 pawn. So black is trying to deflect you and your pieces away from the protection of the c4 pawn. We're not going to allow that. We're going to play bishop c2. Now, b5 is literally the only good move for black. And it looks like black has achieved something. However, we remember en passant. And then queen takes b6. So all of black's counterplay now lies in this a6 fast pawn. This is a rook pawn, meaning that it isn't as strong as it could be. And so we're quite okay in this position. I'm going to show you guys how to defend against this. Bishop e3, queen c7, bishop d4. We want to make sure that we move this bishop out of the way so this rook can protect this e4 pawn. Also, this bishop on d4 is very strong. It attacks this knight and bishop, and it just planted by the c3 pawn. So we want to play queen c1 in order to either play queen a3 or at some point maybe queen a1, something like that. Also, we want to prevent rook b2, so and any bishop h6 ideas also are immediately out of the window. Rook b7, rook a2, and a4. So in this moment in time, taking this pawn is probably not advisable because you lose the e4 pawn. And we just worked so hard in order to maintain that pawn on e4 and protect it, to not get deflected, just to lose it again. But this is possible. You might forget. You might just be low on time, and you might run into this sort of situation, in which case you can play, well, first of all, bishop takes g7, and then queen f4. And this leads to a fine position. You could try and win the c4 pawn, and you will be quite okay. Your opponent might try something like queen b6. The whole point is you cannot actually take this knight because queen b1 check. And, you know, black, whoops, black wins the pieces back and is in a better position here. So you're just going to play and try and maneuver your pieces around. Queen b6 is a tricky move, but you could play something like knight d4 here, and you will be quite okay. Instead of taking this pawn, queen a1 is advisable, and then you can rotate to d2 once you see h6. I mean, anything you see, knight d2 is good. This knight adds an additional protector to the e4 pawn, which is the whole point. Now here, the best move by far is rook b3. If your opponent tries something else, like hanging on to this pawn by playing rook a8, this doesn't work because bishop takes a4, and you might think, hey, rook a7, very scary. I can't move this bishop now. No, not quite. Bishop on d4 saves the day, and you are doing quite well. So you can definitely take the pawn in this case. Best move, though, is rook b3, which looks like a blunder, but it creates two passed pawns, and we're going to have to defend against them. The best way to defend against passed pawns, and I have a video on using passed pawns to your advantage as well as defending against them, you guys can check those out, is to blockade them. So we're going to blockade those pawns. If they're blockaded, that means they cannot move, and therefore there is no more threat. Knight h5, trade this bishop, c4. Now this knight is amazing. Look at it. Protects and attacks so many things. This knight is literally anchoring down this position. And after something like, I don't know, queen c5, you could play rook e3, queen b2. And you might be asking, how are we ever going to progress in this position? Well, we're up 2 points of material, so we're going to sacrifice this knight and for 2 pawns. Now, after these trades, this is a queen and rook versus a queen, bishop, and knight endgame. However, we have 6 pawns and black has 4. So we're once again at an advantageous position. This is going to be very, very depending on your endgame skills. This should not be too difficult. You should be able to convert this position. However, this really has nothing to do with the Benoni position anymore. That's why I'm ending the line here. This is all going to be depending on your endgame skills. And what we can see here is the potential for you to create pass pawns. So if something like h5, even e5 is a good option right now. E5 is a great option, and you're going to have two pass pawns. You're going to work on maneuvering this rook around, maybe drop it back to e1, then b1, move your queen out of the way. Something like b7 is always a good idea. Get your queen, get your rook on the 7th rank, and you're going to be better. You're going to be able to push these pawns, convert this advantage, and win this game. Guys, the Benoni is an incredibly solid setup. It's not necessarily solid, but it's a very strong setup. And I cannot give you a position in which you just automatically win. This is literally as close as it gets to the best setup you could possibly achieve from a Benoni defense. This is very, very good for you. The engine agrees it's plus 1.7. The longer it thinks about it, the more it likes it. You have two extra pawns on the board that you're able to convert into pass pawns with ease. Basically by playing e5 right now, and this position is just great. And you're gonna have to use your endgame skills to navigate this position and just win. But the modern Benoni is very popular, and if you're able to get into this position every time you play, you should find yourself at a great advantage um, and winning most, if not all, of these games. So, ladies and gentlemen, this summarizes everything I wanted to show you for this video. I hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps my channel out a ton, and it will help you stay notified for when future videos come out. Thank you. Now, lastly, if you want to see more videos like this, please consider checking out a video to my left. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye.